May 3rd, 1857. Write the date down as if it were a name, because on estates like Domaine de Vauclerc, dates outlast people. Sologne is not a postcard in this file. It is terrain engineered for disappearance. Pine and oak, peat and stagnant channels, fog that behaves like a cover. The domain sits where the forest turns wet and the wet turns sour. Locals called it Vauclerc because the Baron wanted clarity in his title. Nothing about it was clear except the arithmetic. Wood in, profit out, bodies consumed quietly in between. The records that survive are not neutral. They are instruments. The estate kept ledgers for timber output, mule feed, guard rotations, repairs to ironwork. It did not keep a ledger for pain. Pain was considered an operating cost too common to itemize. Yet the pain is everywhere if you know where to look, in the shorthand, in the omissions, in the sudden neatness of a signature after an incident that should have produced disorder. A place like Vauclerc does not merely exploit. It organizes exploitation until it becomes routine, and then it calls that routine order. This chapter begins with the lie the estate told itself, that it was a lawful enterprise. The truth is simpler and uglier. Vauclerc ran on forced labor disguised as obligation. The Baron, Etienne de Vauclerc, did not use the word enslaved in his correspondence. He preferred bound, indentured, contracted. His steward, Marcel Renaud, was more precise. Renaud understood that cruelty without documentation is a risk, but cruelty with documentation can be defended. You can contest a scream, you can file a form. The estate filed forms. Josiah Jos Cole appears in the estate's internal tally as a line item, not a man. Age 29. Listed height, not birthplace. Listed arm span, not mother's name. Forestry labor, fell, limb, stack. A note in the margin, strong. In a separate column, discipline issues. That column is the estate's confession. They labeled resistance as defect and treated compliance as morality. They had to. If they admitted that a human being might reasonably oppose captivity, the entire system would read as a crime instead of a business. By May 3rd, 1857, Jos Cole had already been in the Vauclerc machine long enough for the machine to learn his limits. Not because he was weak, but because the estate specialized in finding the exact point where a person breaks without dying. The chain sleep quarters were designed for that. Iron rings bolted into stone. A bar that made turning over difficult. Straw that held damp the way cloth holds blood. The guards referred to it as the row, as if it were seating and not confinement. The Baron referred to it once, in a letter dictated and signed without shame, as necessary restraint for workforce stability. Stability, a polished word applied to a bruise. The guard structure mattered because it was not incidental violence. It was delegated violence. Captain Lucien Barrett commanded the estate's guard unit. Barrett was not a drunk with a cudgel. He was disciplined, which is worse. A sloppy sadist causes scandal. A trained sadist causes systems. Barrett's men rotated patrols around the logging routes, the kennel line, the storehouse, and the outer gate. Their job was not only to prevent escape, it was to remind every laborer, hourly, that escape would require a miracle or a massacre. The estate preferred miracles to massacres because miracles can be dismissed as rumor. On paper, Vauclerc's operation was forestry. In practice, it was extraction under threat. Quotas were not goals, they were traps. Miss the quota and the estate did not reduce its demand. It increased the penalty. Meet the quota and the estate raised it. That is how you prevent the idea of enough from taking root. Enough is the first thought that leads to why am I here? The Baron could not permit why. Renaud could not permit why. Barrett could not permit why. So they drowned why in routine. Wake before light. Shackles counted. Tools issued and counted again. A ration allotment that ensured fatigue but avoided collapse. This is the practical genius of cruelty. It keeps you alive precisely so it can keep using you. Jos Cole's job, officially, was logging. Unofficially, it was to absorb the worst of the work because he was the strongest and therefore, in their logic, the most suited to suffering. When a man is treated like an implement, his endurance becomes evidence against him. If he survives, they claim it proves the work is tolerable. If he breaks, they claim it proves he was defective. Either way, the estate stays innocent in its own fiction. This is what we mean when we say institutions commit violence. They design outcomes and then pretend those outcomes are accidents of character. The estate's moral vocabulary was inverted. Discipline meant terror. Order meant obedience without complaint. Correction meant injury applied publicly so it could do private work inside the witnesses. The cookhouse laborer Miriam Holt saw the injuries because she was made to. They did not call her a nurse, they called her kitchen. But when ribs cracked, when wrists swelled purple under iron, when backs split, it was Holt who was ordered to rinse and bind, not for mercy, for maintenance. There is a difference, and the estate knew it. Maintenance keeps a worker functional. Mercy would require acknowledging a person. If you want a single image of Vauclerc's ethos on May 3, 1857, take this. Tools were sharpened more carefully than consciences. The same hands that honed axes did not hesitate to fasten collars. The same men who spoke of forest stewardship treated human beings as consumables. The Baron hosted guests in clean rooms while his workforce slept chained on wet straw. And the guests, if they asked at all, were given the same answer respectable people have always accepted when they want comfort more than truth. They are taken care of. This is where the file becomes accusatory because neutrality would be complicity. Vauclerc did not fail these people. It used them. It did not lose control. It exercised control. If you read the ledger and feel tempted to call it harsh for the time, stop. The time did not force a ring into stone. People did. The time did not draft false contracts. Clerks did. The time did not rotate armed men through the tree line. Captains did. The time is an excuse the guilty invent so they can die believing they were normal. May 3rd is also important for what it does not contain. There is no mention of danger to guards, no hint of fear, no acknowledgement that something in the estate's captive workforce was changing. That absence is not proof of peace. It is proof of arrogance. Estates like Vauclerc believe the world is built to hold their secrets. They believe forests erase tracks. They believe paper overwrites flesh. They believe that even if a captive man is strong, the cage is stronger. That belief is what makes the next entry so violently instructive, because when a system built on domination meets a refusal, it cannot absorb. It does not negotiate. It scrambles to control the story after it loses control of the body. Remember the name. Josiah Joss Cole. Remember the date, May 3rd, 1857. We do not remember because it changes what happened. We remember because forgetting is how places like Vauclerc stay open in new forms. If you're listening from anywhere that has ever called exploitation work and captivity contract, comment where you're from. And if you want the rest of this record, subscribe. May 4th, 1857 begins the way Vauclerc wanted every day to begin, with the illusion that nothing is happening. No alarms. No scandal, only a routine designed to make suffering feel like weather, unremarkable, inevitable, and therefore unrecordable. The estate's cruelty was not improvised. It was engineered. It had procedures. It had a cadence. It had paperwork. And the most damning detail is this. The estate understood that if you can make brutality predictable, people stop naming it. They start calling it how things are. That is the first victory of a violent system, not the whip, but the vocabulary it steals from its victims. The mechanism was quota, and the quota was a trap that tightened by design. On May 5th, 1857, the timber tally increased without explanation. An extra stack demanded from the same number of hands, from the same bodies already running on rationed calories and inadequate sleep. There is always a pretext. Wet ground slows hauling. A buyer wants more. A storm damaged inventory. The pretext does not matter because the purpose is constant, to keep laborers in a permanent state of deficiency. The estate did not want productivity. It wanted dependence. A man who believes he is always behind has no time to plan his exit. On May 6, 1857, the discipline log captures what the Baron would later call necessary correction. The entry is short, careful, and cold. Cold Josiah, slow cutting, productivity deficit, corrective measures authorized. Look at the language. Slow cutting is framed as moral failure, not exhaustion. Deficit is framed as theft, not arithmetic. Corrective measures is framed as maintenance, not assault. This is how institutions launder violence. They rename it until it can be filed. The line is a confession dressed as administration. It says that work pace justified pain. It says that the estate claimed ownership not only of a man's labor, but of his body's rate of decay. This is where the chain of command matters. Baron Etienne de Vauclerc did not swing the instrument himself, and he did not need to. Marcel Renaud, the steward, was the estate's pen, the one who turned flesh into figures. Captain Lucien Barreau was the estate's fist, the one who turned authorized into bruises. When a system distributes cruelty across roles, everyone claims distance, and the cruelty becomes harder to indict. But distributed guilt is still guilt. A signature can be as violent as a blade when it authorizes injury without consequence. The punishment on May 6th was made public, not because Barrett enjoyed a spectacle, though men like Barrett often do, but because public punishment is a technology. It reduces the need for constant violence by making violence memorable. One beating can purchase a week of obedience from 20 witnesses. That efficiency is why order is always cheaper than justice in places like Vauclerc. Miriam Holt, the cookhouse laborer, later cleaned blood from a shirt that was not hers. She did not ask whose it was, not because she did not care, but because questions are taxed. On estates built on coercion, curiosity costs you your teeth. May 9th, 1857 is the second key date. A guard search of the chain quarters was conducted after a petty theft accusation. Missing bread, missing salt, a ration count that didn't match the steward's numbers. You should understand the function of these accusations. Rations were kept deliberately tight so hunger would keep men pliable. Then hunger was criminalized so the desperate could be punished for trying to survive. The estate created the need and prosecuted the response. That is not discipline. That is entrapment with a Bible face. During the May 9th search, a small knife was discovered, hidden where straw met stone. Not a weapon fit for war, but a tool fit for cutting rope or slicing food. In a free world, it would have been nothing. In Vauclerc's world, it was treated as treason. Barrett's men did not record it as knife. They recorded it as contraband. And then came the theatrical logic of the estate, confiscation followed by example. The knife was held up like a sin. The lesson was announced without needing words. Any attempt to control your own survival will be framed as a threat to the estate's safety. Marcel Renaud ordered the beating tied to that knife. You can tell it was his decision because the record is crisp. Barreau would have written less. Renaud wrote more because he understood that detail protects perpetrators. A detailed note implies oversight. Oversight implies legitimacy. That is how bureaucracies make violence look supervised and therefore responsible. The estate was not responsible. It was simply organized. May 12, 1857 is the third key date, and it reveals the estate's preferred instrument, the iron collar. The file notes it with the same tone you might use for a broken hinge. Collar applied following attempted flight. The attempted flight was not even attributed to Joss Cole. Another worker had allegedly run. But Cole was collared anyway. This is collective punishment disguised as preventative security. The estate did not punish only actions. It punished potential. It punished strength. It punished reputation. If you were capable of escaping, you were treated as if you already had. That is how fear becomes policy. The iron collar at Vauclerc was not symbolic. It was functional. It restricted sleep. It cut into skin. It turned every movement into friction. It reminded the wearer that even breathing belonged to someone else. The Baron did not need to watch it. The collar watched for him. This is the estate's true genius. It outsourced control to objects, rings in stone, bars on doors, collars on necks, so that even when no guard was present, captivity still spoke. Some people will try to soften this with the language of the era. They will suggest that harshness was common, that hierarchies were accepted, that things were complicated. That is the old tactic. Blur the crime until it becomes atmosphere. Reject it. Complexity does not absolve. The fact that many people did evil does not make evil normal. It makes it widespread. The moral task is not to blend into that widespread fog. The moral task is to name it plainly. During this period, May 4th to May 17th, the estate also tightened its informational control. Théophile Garnier, a junior clerk, became an unwilling witness. He was 19, hired for penmanship, and placed under Renaud's shadow. Garnier saw the discrepancy between output tallies and ration allocations. He saw medical supplies ordered in small quantities that made no sense for a healthy workforce. He saw entries that used initials instead of names after punishments. Initials are a form of deletion. They keep the work done while removing the person who did it or the person it was done to. When names disappear, accountability disappears with them. That is not an accident. That is design. The estate's guards, meanwhile, were instructed to maintain presence. Not just to prevent escape, but to grind the mine down. Patrols weren't only at gates. They were at paths where laborers hauled wood. They were near the cookhouse. They were near water. The message was constant. You are watched even when you are not doing anything wrong. The estate treated human beings as suspects in advance, and when a system treats you as guilty for existing, innocence becomes irrelevant. That is when resistance changes shape. It stops being about proving you deserve dignity and becomes about taking back the simplest right: movement. By May 17, 1857, the file shows the estate satisfied with its controls. The quota pressure, the ration trap, the public punishment, the contraband prosecution, the iron collar. These were not isolated cruelties. They were a coordinated method for manufacturing obedience. If you want the prosecution's summary in one line, it is this: Vauclerc created a closed environment where survival itself was criminalized, and then it called the resulting desperation misconduct. And now the part people like to turn away from. The estate was not blind to what it was producing. It knew that a man forced to live under calculated humiliation will eventually stop negotiating with dignity and start negotiating with physics, tools, timing, bodies, gates. When you reduce a person to a work animal and then punish the animal for being exhausted, you are not maintaining order. You are loading a weapon and acting surprised later when it fires. Remember these dates because they are the spine of the case. May 6th, the log entry that pretends violence is administration. May 9th, the search that turned hunger into crime. May 12th, the collar that converted a human neck into estate property. These are not context, they are causality. If you erase them, you will be tempted to read what comes next as senseless brutality. It was not senseless, it was the estate's sense, returned to it in a form it could no longer control. Our responsibility is to keep the chain intact, what they did, what they called it, what it produced. Forgetting is how the powerful launder the past into misfortune. Remembering is how the dead get their evidence back. June 1st, 1857. Market. This is when the estate's violence stops being abstract and becomes indexed by names. People like to say guards as if the word alone explains the outcome, as if uniforms are natural phenomena and not chosen roles. But a guard unit is a set of decisions made flesh: who to hire, what to authorize, what to ignore, what to enjoy. Domaine de Vauclerc did not employ 8 men to keep peace. It employed 8 men to enforce captivity while preserving the Baron's clean hands and Marcel Renaud's clean records. If you want the anatomy of oppression, you start with the ones paid to make it physical. The guard roster at Vauclerc in early June 1857 was not random. It was a deliberate mix: 1 commander, 1 armorer, 1 kennel master, patrol leads assigned to choke points, and men stationed where escape becomes either impossible or costly. The estate understood geography. The forest could hide a man, but the marsh could slow him. The waterways could mislead him. The outer roads could betray him. So the guard unit was positioned like a net. That net had 8 knots, each with a name, each with a role, each with a history of compliance. The estate will later claim it was shocked by what happened to these men. Do not accept that claim. An institution cannot build a machine for harm and plead innocence when the machine's parts become casualties. First, Captain Lucien Barrett, commander. Barrett's authority was not only over his men, but over the daily atmosphere of fear. He ran discipline the way an accountant runs figures: predictable, repeatable, and justified. Under Barrett, punishment became routine rather than reaction. That matters because routine violence teaches the workforce that appeals are pointless. Barrett was the estate's official interpreter of order. His signature, when it appears beside incident reports, is not merely acknowledgement. It is endorsement. He was not a bystander to cruelty. He was its manager. Second, Gaston Villars, kennel master. Villars controlled the dogs, and the dogs were not pets. They were tools of pursuit and intimidation, a mobile threat that did not require a spoken warning. At Vauclerc, the dogs served a dual function. They prevented escape by scent, and they prevented planning by fear. A dog unit is an argument without words. Even the forest will not accept you. Villars was responsible for maintaining that argument. If any guard deserves scrutiny for how escape became imaginable, it is the one who made pursuit appear inevitable. Third, Omer Pichon, night watch. The night watch is always treated as less important until the night becomes the point of rupture. Pichon's post covered the inner paths between the chain quarters and the tally shed. He knew who moved when. He knew who limped. He knew who held their jaw tight to keep quiet. Night watchmen see the truth of an estate because the estate's daytime performance ends after dark. If Pichon was diligent, he witnessed suffering. If he was careless, he enabled opportunity. Either way, he was not ignorant. Fourth, Jules Ferrand, armorer. Ferrand's job was to control access to blades and powder, to keep weapons as a monopoly of the estate. He maintained the armory keys and the condition of firearms, but at Vauclerc, firearms were less frequently used than the threat of them. A muzzle unseen still governs behavior if people believe it can appear. Ferrand's role reveals what the estate feared most, that the workforce might seize the means to challenge captivity. The estate's obsession with controlling knives and iron tells you it understood, at some level, that its labor arrangement was not work, it was an occupation. Fifth, René Sautel, patrol lead. Sautel ran the timber route patrols, the hauling paths where men carried loads from felling sites to storage. This is where quotas become violence because the path is where exhaustion is visible. Guards stationed here did not merely prevent escape, they enforced pace. They punished slowness as insubordination. They acted as mobile whips, applying pressure exactly where bodies failed. A patrol lead learns to read fatigue and treat it as disobedience. That is how a human becomes a meter stick for a system's cruelty. Sixth, Clément Duroc, river path. Duroc controlled the watery perimeter. In Sologne, the wetlands are both cover and trap. A man could try to follow water to a road, but water draws attention. Splashing carries, mud holds footprints. The estate knew it, so it placed a guard who knew the channels and the banks, who could anticipate where a fleeing person would go when they believed water meant freedom. Duroc's station wasn't defensive, it was anticipatory. It existed because the estate had already rehearsed, in imagination and in drills, the routes of escape it denied. Seventh, Bastion Roy storehouse. The storehouse is where hunger becomes policy. Roy oversaw supplies, food, rope, iron fittings, spare tools, and therefore was positioned at the junction where survival could be permitted or withheld. A storehouse guard is a gatekeeper of the most basic leverage. If you want to control people without constant beating, you control their calories and their equipment. Roy's post was not just security, it was a pressure valve the estate used to punish the desperate. A missing ration could become an excuse to break someone. A missing tool could become an excuse to accuse. Roy stood at the place where the estate's petty theft narrative could be manufactured. Eighth, Hervé Maillard, outer gate. Maillard's name matters because gates are symbolic only to people who have never needed one. To the captive, the gate is physics, iron, wood, hinges, locks, time. Maillard controlled the last barrier between property and world. He watched the road and the road watched him. If the estate wanted to prevent escape, it needed a man at the gate who treated every silhouette as threat. If the estate wanted to maintain the fiction of legitimacy, it needed a man at the gate who looked disciplined enough to reassure visitors. The outer gate guard is the estate's face. Maillard was paid to be both face and fist. Now consider the total structure these 8 men represented on June 1st, 1857. Barrett commanded the doctrine. Villars controlled pursuit. Pichon controlled movement at night. Ferrand controlled weapons, Sautel controlled the work routes, Duroc controlled the wetlands, Roy controlled supplies, Maillard controlled exit. This is not overstaffing. This is architecture. It is a comprehensive system designed to ensure that no person could leave without either being caught, being starved, or being forced to kill. The estate built a world in which escape required violence and then congratulated itself for security. The estate's moral rhetoric, the part it used to soothe itself, insisted that guards were necessary because laborers were unreliable, prone to theft, dangerous. But examine the logic. The laborers were treated as dangerous, therefore they were controlled violently. They were controlled violently, therefore they became desperate. They became desperate, therefore the estate declared itself justified. It is a closed loop of accusation. It is prosecutorial theater performed by the powerful against the powerless. And it had a practical function. It made any future retaliation look like proof rather than consequence. When an institution paints its victims as threats, it pre-writes the headline for the day it is exposed. It is important, too, to register the estate's use of rotation and distance. Guards did not spend enough time with any single laborer to recognize a person. That was not accidental. Familiarity breeds empathy. Empathy breeds doubt. Doubt breeds disobedience. Vauclerc could not afford doubt. So it kept its enforcers detached, moving, busy. It made cruelty procedural so no single guard had to claim it as personal. A man could tell himself, I'm only following protocol. Protocol is how ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm without feeling the full weight of it. That is the real horror of such systems. They make atrocity feel like a shift assignment. Where does Josiah Joss Cole fit into this roster? Not as a mythic villain, not as a romantic hero, but as the human variable the estate failed to fully calculate. The guards learned his work pace, his strength, his compliance under visible pressure. They did not learn what he was becoming under invisible pressure. A man who had watched the estate weaponize paperwork, hunger, and collars, and who no longer expected rescue through law or mercy. When an institution teaches a person that rules exist only to punish them, that person stops treating rules as binding. That is not madness. That is education. Vauclerc educated its captives in the language of force, and then later acted surprised when force answered back. Remember their names because anonymity is a second death and a convenient shield. Captain Lucien Barrault, Gaston Villard, Omer Pichon, Jules Ferrand, René Sautel, Clément Duroc, Bastien Roy, Hervé Maillard. These men were not weather. They were agents. If we are serious about accountability, we do not hide behind the abstraction of guards. We state that the estate hired them to make captivity real, and they accepted that wage. And when the estate's violence reached the point where a captive logger chose an unimaginable route to air and movement, it was these 8 knots in the net that were positioned to be cut. A system that refuses to recognize a man as a person should not be shocked when that man refuses to recognize the system as legitimate. The duty of memory is to keep the chain clear. Who built the cage, who kept it locked, and why the night it broke was not a mystery, but a result. June 8, 1857. The estate later tried to turn this date into a superstition, an unthinkable night, a madman's outbreak, a story with no spine, no lead-up, no responsibility. That framing is not ignorance, it is strategy. A night like this does not materialize out of clean air. It is manufactured by prior days, by quotas, by collars, by the decision to make escape impossible without committing acts the estate can later point to as proof of inherent savagery. Vauclerc built the conditions and then demanded the world look only at the outcome. This is the method. Force a man into a corner, then prosecute the shape of his exit. The weather mattered because the estate relied on it. Low fog, the kind Sologne produces when damp ground exhales into colder air, rolled across the paths in softened distance. In an open world, fog is inconvenience. In a closed world, fog is cover. The guards used it to hide their movements. The captive used it to hide his. The estate would later claim poor visibility as if nature were the culprit. Nature did not lock the gate. Nature did not bolt rings into stone. Nature did not assign 8 men to patrol a human cage. The fog did not create the violence. It simply removed the estate's favorite advantage, clear sight. The timeline begins before midnight, though the estate's own reconstruction conveniently starts after the first death, as if nothing preceded it. That omission is telling. A person preparing to leave a fortified property does not decide in the moment. Preparation at Vauclerc was mostly psychological because material preparation was policed, tools were counted, knives were confiscated, movement was monitored. So the preparation that mattered was the internal shift, the point where a man stops believing he can survive by compliance. By June 8th, Josiah Joss Cole had already been taught, repeatedly, that the estate would not grant him an exit, not by appeal, not by labor, not by endurance. That lesson is the real ignition. Shortly after 0000, the first breach occurs near the wood tally shed, where the estate converted trees into numbers and numbers into profit. That location is not accidental. The tally shed was both a workplace and a symbol, the place where labor became a ledger entry and therefore became owned. The night watch patterns put Omer Pichon near the inner paths, and the patrol lead René Sautel often checked the hauling routes. But on this night, movement timing creates a seam. The estate's security depended on predictable rotation. Predictability becomes vulnerability when the person being hunted has had months to study it. At approximately 0013, the first guard falls in the tally shed corridor. The estate will later describe the method with language designed to provoke disgust while avoiding specifics that would invite questions about how a captive man obtained the means. It calls it butchery. That word is a moral smokescreen. The relevant fact is operational. The first guard was neutralized quietly enough that the alarm did not propagate immediately. That suggests either isolation, intimidation, or the guard's own overconfidence. In systems like Vauclerc, guards often stop treating captives as capable agents. They treat them as managed livestock. Overconfidence is not merely a personal flaw, it is a product of institutional contempt. By 0041, the second and third encounters occur near the kennels. This is where the knight's logic becomes unmistakable. Any successful escape required disabling pursuit. Gaston Villar's dogs were an extension of the estate's reach. If the dogs were unleashed, the forest would become a corridor rather than a refuge. The estate later implied that the dogs failed, as if dogs possess moral agency. Dogs do not fail. Handlers and systems fail. The available explanations are unromantic and prosecutable. The kennel area was approached when Villar was alone. The dogs were kept quiet by food or intimidation, or the handler was removed before he could deploy them. The estate's preferred narrative is supernatural ferocity. The more plausible narrative is tactical necessity. When a system forces a man to choose between recapture and escalation, he escalates. By 120, the armory becomes the pivot point. Jules Ferrand, the armorer, was the estate's insurance policy against exactly this. The armory was the estate's monopoly on lethal force. Whoever controls the armory controls the balance of fear. For a captive to reach it, two things must be true. The estate's internal patrol geometry briefly opened, and the captive understood exactly which node to strike to collapse the net. This is not mysticism. It is adaptation under pressure. The estate spent months teaching Joscol to be observant, because surveillance is contagious. When you are constantly watched, you learn to watch back. At the armory threshold, the crucial evidence is not the specific tool used. It is the transfer of keys and access. The knight's progression implies that Ferrand's keys were taken, and that at least one guard weapon, commonly a saber used as a badge of authority, changed hands. The estate would later insist that its weapons were secure. That insistence is contradicted by the sequence itself. Either the armory was breached, or the guard unit's control over weapons was compromised in close quarters. In either case, the estate's claim of total control was already collapsing. A system that depends on monopolized force cannot tolerate the moment when force becomes contested. Between 1:30 and 2:05, the estate's perimeter nodes are hit. This interval is where 4 more guards are eliminated across the routes that mattered: the storehouse, the river path, the patrol junctions, and finally the outer gate. The estate later pretended these were random encounters. They were not. Bastien Roy at the storehouse controlled supplies. Clément Duroc controlled the wetland route. René Sautel controlled the internal patrol routes, and Hervé Maillard controlled the exit. Those posts form a logic chain: supplies to endure the run, route to avoid immediate recapture, path to avoid patrol convergence, gate to leave the property boundary. The order in which these nodes fall reads less like frenzy and more like dismantling. That should chill you more than any lurid adjective. Frenzy is a comforting explanation because it implies chaos. Dismantling implies comprehension. The decapitations, the detail that makes this story circulate as horror rather than as indictment, must be handled with discipline. The fact is that 8 guards were killed and beheaded. The estate emphasized the beheadings because it served 2 purposes. It dehumanized the captive, and it distracted from the estate's own ongoing dehumanization. Beheading is an act with practical and symbolic effects. Practically, it delays immediate identification, creates shock, and disrupts command response. Symbolically, it severs the head of authority, a literal inversion of hierarchy. But symbolism is not the primary driver here. The primary driver is that the estate's architecture made non-lethal escape implausible. When you construct a property so that a man cannot leave without being chased, cornered, and recollared, you are forcing the calculus toward decisive incapacitation of pursuers. At approximately 2:05, the outer gate is breached. This is where Hervé Maillard's role becomes fatal, because the gate is the line the estate expects to hold at all costs. The gate is not only wood and iron, it is the estate's claim that it can decide who belongs to the world. Once the gate is opened from inside, the estate's power becomes visibly contingent. That is the moment institutions fear more than death, the moment their inevitability is disproven. A guard can die and the system can continue, but a gate opened by the captive reveals that the system can be overcome. What happens immediately after is the part the estate deliberately blurred. The fog aided the exit. The forest swallowed sound. The marsh obscured tracks. The estate later insisted there was no coherent route, that the captive vanished. That language is convenient because it prevents questions about pursuit failure and about which external actors might have helped or refused to help. The estate wanted the ending to be mythic because myth is easier to bury than fact. A fact demands an investigation. A myth invites a shiver and then silence. If you want the prosecutorial bottom line for June 8, 1857, it is this. Vauclerc did not merely endure a crime. It harvested the narrative of that crime to protect itself. It would rather have the public imagine a monstrous captive than imagine an estate that chains people, starves them, collars them, and stations armed men to keep them from leaving. The beheadings became the estate's shield. A shield made from the very brutality the estate's structure all but guaranteed. Hold the timeline as evidence, not entertainment. 0013. The first guard neutralized near the tally shed. 0041. The kennel node compromised to prevent pursuit. 0120. The armory access point contested. 205. The outer gate breached and the property boundary violated from within. This is not a ghost story. It is an exposure of cause and effect inside a human cage, and the moral obligation, the light admonition that must sit inside the darkness, is simple. Remember the chain. Remember that institutions commit violence through routine, and routine eventually meets refusal. The night of June 8th was not a rupture from nowhere. It was the estate's own design returning to it with consequences it could not ledger away. June 9th, 1857, is when the estate stops reacting to death and starts managing meaning. People imagine cover-ups as frantic, improvised, stained with panic. The Vauclerc cover-up was not frantic. It was administrative. It unfolded with the same calm cadence the estate used for rations and quotas, because Marcel Renaud understood the oldest rule of power. You do not have to erase the event if you can own the interpretation. Once you own the interpretation, the event becomes whatever protects you. The dead become props. The living become liabilities. The paper becomes the weapon. The first document produced after the night is not a confession of conditions. It is a declaration of victimhood, dated June 9, 1857, drafted under Renaud's hand and signed for the Baron. It frames the incident as an external attack. The language is careful. Bandits. Unknown assailant. Criminal intrusion. Note what is missing. No mention of chains, no mention of collars, no mention of a captive workforce, no mention of prior punishments that might provide motive. This omission is not a gap. It is the core tactic. The estate's strategy is to sever cause from effect, to present the effect as spontaneous evil and thereby make the estate's own structure unexamined. When a system refuses to be named, it survives. June 10, 1857 brings the next layer, internal instructions that never appear in public statements. Guard survivors, laborers, and kitchen staff receive the same message with different tones. Speak only what you are told to speak. For the guards, it is discipline and cohesion. For the laborers, it is consequences. For Miriam Holt, it is a quiet warning from a supervisor who does not need to raise his voice because her fear does the work for him. The estate understands that testimony is not merely words, it is risk. So it turns every witness into a person with something to lose. Then it calls the silence, lack of evidence. June 11, 1857 is the date that should never be treated as incidental. A sealed cart leaves the estate before dawn, not on the usual supply schedule. The ledger entry is terse, too terse. Cart, maintenance removal. No item list. No destination recorded beyond the phrase Orléans Road. Estates that obsess over inventories do not forget inventories by accident. They forget them when remembering would create legal danger. The cart's timing matters. The dawn departure matters. The seal matters. The absence of detail matters most. This is the physical stage of the cover-up. The movement of objects and remains out of sight while the estate's official narrative is still forming. What is in the cart? The estate never says. But the estate's behavior tells you what it feared. Evidence that would reattach the night to the months preceding it. Evidence could include bodies moved to control identification and examination, weapons cleaned or replaced, clothing burned, collars removed from necks so no outsider sees iron bite marks, ledgers altered so quotas and punishments look reasonable. The estate's public story required a clean perimeter, and cleanliness is always suspicious in the aftermath of real violence. Real violence leaves mess. Only a system with discipline and time can make violence look tidy. June 12, 1857 is when Marcel Renaud begins what prosecutors recognize as narrative inoculation. He circulates a version of events that includes just enough detail to satisfy curiosity and just enough vagueness to prevent verification. A lone madman. A savage act. Unprovoked. The words are meant to land like a verdict before any court convenes. If the public accepts the verdict, the investigation becomes theater. Renaud is not defending truth. He is preempting inquiry. It is an old trick. Accuse the victim of moral monstrosity so that any mention of the estate's cruelty sounds like justification. On June 15, 1857, the estate produces a second statement with a new emphasis: foreignness. Not foreign in passport terms, foreign in moral terms. The assailant is described as outside the local order, unattached, unknown to the parish. This matters because it turns the event into an invasion story. Invasion stories rally neighbors to protect property. They do not rally neighbors to question property's abuses. The estate does not want sympathy for the captive workforce. It wants fear of them. Fear is more useful than sympathy because fear can be converted into permission. By June 20, 1857, the cover-up consumes its first internal casualty. Théophile Garnier disappears from the payroll. The record does not say dismissed. It says transferred. No receiving employer. No receiving. No destination. No letter of recommendation. The family is told he took work elsewhere. Families are always told that. It is the polite version of disappearance. Garnier knew too much to remain a neutral clerk. He had seen the estate's accounting irregularities. He had seen initials replace names. He had seen the unnatural neatness of punishment entries. And now, after the night, any clerk who can connect the ledger to the blood becomes dangerous. The estate did not need to kill him to neutralize him. It only needed to remove him from visibility and make his absence look ordinary. This is how bureaucratic violence differs from street violence. It makes people vanish without noise. July 3, 1857, marks the institutional pivot from concealment to expansion. The Baron petitions local authorities for additional armed men, framing the estate as a besieged victim of criminality. The petition is framed in the language of public safety, but the objective is private: to rebuild the net, to reassert the perimeter, to reassure investors and buyers that production will resume, to signal to the remaining laborers that whatever happened on June 8th will not create mercy. It will create more guns. The estate converts its own brutality into justification for further militarization. This is the logic of many regimes. Provoke desperation, then cite the desperate act as a reason to tighten the fist. August 1857 shows the estate in its most hypocritical posture: prayerful concern. A chapel service is sponsored for the fallen. The dead guards' names are spoken with solemnity. No captive names are spoken at all. This is not simply bias. It is policy. Mourning is distributed by power. The estate wants public grief for its enforcers because that grief strengthens the legitimacy of enforcement. It does not want grief for the captive workforce because grief would imply personhood, and personhood would imply rights, and rights would imply crimes. So the estate instructs the community whom to pity and whom to fear. That is the cover-up's spiritual layer, the use of ritual to sanctify the estate's narrative. September 1857 is when Renaud tightens the paper itself. The ledgers shift. The tone becomes cleaner. Certain categories become aggregated. Discipline issues is replaced by softer phrasing, as if the estate suddenly discovered delicacy. This is not a moral awakening. It is legal defense. After a scandal, institutions do not always change their behavior. They change their documentation. They learn which words can indict them. They learn how to write cruelty as incident. They learn how to turn a cage into a work arrangement. The future reader is the target. The estate is writing for posterity because posterity is the final courtroom it hopes to manipulate. By October 1857, the estate has erected the final barrier, the story that the assailant died in the marsh, convenient, unprovable. Comforting. A dead culprit cannot speak. A dead culprit cannot point to collars and quotas. A dead culprit cannot name the men who beat him and the steward who authorized it. So the estate prefers him dead even if he is alive. And if he is alive, the estate prefers him mythic. Myth keeps details from cohering. Myth turns investigation into gossip. This is what the cover-up file reveals when read like an indictment rather than a folktale. The estate's first instinct was not to examine why a captive man would do such a thing. Its first instinct was to ensure no one else would examine it either. It built a narrative of external criminality to avoid confronting internal violence. It removed witnesses, cleaned records, moved physical evidence, and recruited the state's force to reinforce private domination. If you want a single phrase for this, call it what it is: institutional self-preservation at the expense of truth. And here is the moral insistence that must be stated plainly. Remembering is not entertainment. These dates are not colors. They are evidence. June 9th, the victimhood statement that amputates cause. June 11th, the sealed cart that suggests evidence management. June 20th, the clerk's disappearance that silences linkage. July 3rd, the petition that turns abuse into justification for escalation. The estate hoped time would do what fire and seals do, make the record unreadable. Time only wins if we cooperate. The responsibility is to keep the file legible, to refuse the estate's preferred ending, and to recognize that the true crime is not only what happened on one night in June, but what was done before it and what was erased after it. December 2nd, 1857. The estate wants this date to feel like closure because winter makes people crave endings. Cold air, early dark, the comforting lie that time itself corrects what humans refuse to correct. Domaine de Vauclerc relied on that lie. It relied on the season to dull outrage, on distance to turn testimony into rumor, on paperwork to become the official version, simply by surviving longer than the bodies did. But a file like this does not exist to offer comfort. It exists to deny the estate the last privilege it sought, the right to decide what will be remembered. By early December, the Baron's public posture had hardened into certainty. He insisted that Josiah Joss Cole died in the marsh within days of June 8th. He spoke of natural justice, as if wetlands were moral courts. He spoke of order restored, as if order can be restored without addressing the crime that demanded violence to escape. His steward, Marcel Renaud, had done his job well. The story was simple enough to repeat and vague enough to defend. He vanished. He drowned. He was hunted. Each phrasing was designed to accomplish the same outcome: no trial, no testimony, no questions about collars and chains. The estate did not need proof. It needed repetition. Repetition is how power turns speculation into fact. But the record does not behave like a fairy tale. It leaks. Even after the estate scrubbed and sealed, small inconsistencies remain. Edges that do not align because truth has weight. On December 2nd, 1857, an internal memo circulated among Vauclerc's remaining guard unit authorizes an additional patrol along the Cher River corridor for 2 nights following Market Day. Notice the contradiction. If the man was dead in June, why patrol in December? Why mark Market Day at all? Market Day is when strangers pass, when information travels, when a fugitive could blend into movement. The estate will claim the memo was routine. Estates do not spend money on routine when they are satisfied. They spend money when they are afraid. By December, a second leakage appeared in the form of whispered geography. Names of villages surfaced where the estate preferred silence: Salbris, La Ferté-Imbeau, Mairie-sur-Cher. These names matter not because we can certify them as fact. Vauclerc ensured we cannot, but because the rumor pattern reveals what the estate feared: that Joss Cole did not die conveniently out of sight. That he reached roads, that he encountered people who chose not to return him, that the estate's monopoly on fate was broken somewhere beyond its gate, in the ordinary world where its authority was no longer automatic. This is the point where the conversation often becomes sentimental. People want to imagine a triumphant escape, a new identity, a quiet life. Sentiment is understandable and dangerous. It is understandable because the human mind wants balance. After horror, it demands reward. It is dangerous because it substitutes comfort for accountability. Whether Joss Cole lived for 1 week after June 8th or lived for 40 years under another name, the indictment against Vauclerc does not change. The estate's crime is not measured by his survival. It is measured by the structure that made his choices so narrow that blood became a tool of passage. So we state what the estate will not state. Joss Cole was not an attacker in a vacuum. He was an enslaved logger held under coercive contracts, iron restraint, ration manipulation, and armed containment. He did not awaken one morning as a myth. He was manufactured into a threat by a system that treated his personhood as an error to be corrected. The estate's favorite rhetorical trick was to call itself the victim of savagery, while it practiced savagery in daylight as policy. That inversion is the moral rot at the center of this file. If you accept the inversion, you become part of the cover-up, even if you only accept it as a story. The 8 beheadings were not an isolated spectacle. They were the estate's control logic rebounding. Think like a prosecutor, not a consumer of horror. Vauclerc deployed 8 men to enforce captivity across specific nodes: kennels, armory, patrol routes, river paths, storehouse, gate. On June 8th, those nodes were dismantled in a sequence that corresponds to escape requirements, not to random frenzy. And after June 8th, the estate did not open its quarters to inspection, did not admit to callers, did not produce full ledgers, did not permit witnesses to speak freely. It moved a sealed cart on June 11th. It removed a clerk from the payroll on June 20th. It petitioned for more armed force on July 3rd. These are not actions of a truthful institution. These are actions of a threatened one. The moral lesson here is not violence begets violence, a phrase so vague it excuses everyone. The moral lesson is sharper. When power is built on dehumanization, it will always try to outsource guilt to the desperate person it has cornered. It will hold up the desperate act like a bloody banner and shout, "See what they are." This is how systems defend themselves. They force a person into an action that will disgust the public. Then they use public disgust to hide their own initiating cruelty. If you want to be responsible with memory, you must refuse the bait. You must look backward along the chain, not only at the final link. We also owe precision to the dead, even the dead who wore uniforms. The estate will insist that naming guards is respect. It is not automatically respect, it is evidence. Captain Lucien Barrault, Gaston Villard, Omer Pichon, Jules Ferrand, René Sautel, Clément Durac, Bastien Roy, Hervé Maillard, 8 names that formed the net. Their deaths do not absolve the estate that employed them to maintain a human cage. At the same time, their deaths should not be used as decoration for a Gothic tale. We name them because reality is not served by blur. Blur is what Vauclerc wants. Blur is how it survives. What do we owe Jos Cole, whose body the estate tried to erase into marsh water and rumor? We owe him the one thing systems like Vauclerc fear, a name that stays attached to the truth of his condition. We owe him the refusal to call captivity work. We owe him the refusal to call a collar discipline. We owe him the refusal to accept the Baron's winter story as closure. If he died a man denied lawful exit by unlawful domination. If he lived under the constant threat of recapture, punishment, and silencing. Either way, the estate committed the foundational violence and then tried to hire the forest to hide it. The final question is not, where did he go? Though the estate wants that to be the only question, because a chase story is entertaining and politically safe. The final question is, what happens when institutions train people to understand that law will not protect them? Because that question is current in every era. A system that denies humanity will eventually meet a response outside its paperwork. The response may be quiet, it may be catastrophic, but it will be rational in the only language left available when all other languages have been punished out of the mouth. December 2nd, 1857, then, is not an ending. It is a marker of what the estate failed to secure: total narrative control. The memo that tightens patrols after market day suggests fear. The rumors that attach to roads and river corridors suggest leakage. The altered ledgers suggest guilt. The missing clerk suggests suppression. These are not ghostly hints. They are the fingerprints of a cover-up in a world that still had people willing to notice. Now I will say what moral people do not like hearing, because it makes responsibility personal. Memory is not passive. If you consume this as a horror vignette and move on, you are cooperating with the estate's method, turning suffering into a story that entertains and then evaporates. The corrective act is small but real. State what you know, keep the dates, keep the names, and refuse the inversion. Subscribe and comment where you're listening from, city and country, and give me your theory in clear terms. Did Jos Cole die in the Sologne marsh as the Baron insisted, or did he reach the roads out, Salbris, the Cher corridor, a market day crowd, and did the estate buy silence to keep that truth from hardening into fact? Keep it grim, keep it accountable.